Okay, Rabbi said, good morning. Today is Toiv, Yud Zayin Elul. Tomorrow is Chayel. I mean, Ariella is not here. I'm assuming that tomorrow there's a Shir. Right? There's no parade and a Shir. Aber ich weiß nicht. Elu dvaram shein lehem Shir. Habilti Seder, Habilti Seder, noch Habilti Seder. We're here today. Mepnei Siba. I made a decision based on some complaints that I got that the second hour, in other words, after this, we'll talk about Temchet Mimim. I sort of said on Friday, Temchet Mimim's birthday was Friday, and the Rebbe Yatis Chassaneh was Wednesday. And so in the second hour, I'm going to talk a little bit about Temchet Mimim. That's the plan. But now we're learning Tanya. Tanya, I don't like to be mevatel. Tanya, I like to do religiously. So, was I here last Sunday? I wasn't here last Sunday. So it's been 2 weeks. We're in Perikei Dalit, we're Daf Yutes Amud Beis, which I guess is page 38. And we're holding Masha Enkin Bedovor Amosor Lelev, which is 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Now we did this last week. And this is one of those pieces of Tanya that I've seen notes of the Rebbe that indicate that the Sosum is Yoser Alagoli. The Alter Rebbe say Ezok Tepes. The Alter Rebbe is, quote, wasting words. The Alter Rebbe doesn't waste words. And the Alter Rebbe does here is interesting. I'm a little bit more prepared than I was 2 weeks ago, but I'm not happy with my Achon. Ich habe das great. I prepared myself, but I'm not satisfied with my preparation, but I got to teach, right? So that's life. Yeah? That's the limitation of life. When you have to show up in class, you have to show up in class. So I'll tell you what the deal is. Okay, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and I don't want to just spend the whole morning repeating 2 weeks ago's class. It doesn't do anybody any favors. But l'chalapachas de nekuda, in other words. The Alter Rebbe uses a phrase called Dovor HaMosor Lelev. Dovor HaMosor Lelev means things that have to do with the heart. When it comes to Dovor HaMosor Lelev, the Alter Rebbe says 2 things. Number 1, not all people are the same. And number 2, even in a person, like kol ha'itim shaves, not all times are the same. Sometimes you're in this mood, sometimes you're in this. Dovor HaMosor Lelev, you want to talk about emotion? Nit alle seinen gleich, nit alle mol is gleich. I told you, if you remember 2 weeks ago, we just read, I had read in the Fachabad or the Beis Mashiach, or both, about the passing of Harav Yosef, had a second name, Yisrael Yosef Zalmanov. And I mentioned to a Yechidus that he had with the Rebbe in Cheshvan Tafshirach, before the Rebbe's official Kabbalah on the Siyas, he was a Bachar. He couldn't have been how old, he was a Bachar. My father's age, a little bit older, by mitzvah age, a year elder. That he asked the Rebbe, how come in Avodas Hashem he finds shinuyim? Amol davens sich besser, amol davens sich nicht as good. Sometimes he davens better, sometimes he doesn't daven as well. So the Rebbe gave him an answer for tzaddikim, a mamish. The answer the Rebbe gave him was, Valim Maile is do shinuyim, b'meile is lamata do shinuyim. Since Lamaila, there's changes in the Eibish's relationship with us, so in the Avodah, it manifests down here in shinuyim. Now what kind of answer is that to a bocher of a mitzvah age? Why do you move about Hashem? The simple tenets. Yate said, Hora, you haven't met him. It's gehet for them. Sometimes you're in a... Apparently, this Bocher, or Bocherul, how old could he have been in Tafshin Yud Aleph? I don't know when he was born, but he wasn't too much older than my father. He was in Shiva the same age, the same time. So my father's bar mitzvah was in Tafshin Yud Aleph. So let's say he was 14. He was almost like 15 years. He wasn't older than 15, even 16. And the Rebbe gives such an answer. When I read it at the time, I thought that this was Kodim Kabbalah Sanasiyas. Since the Rebbe was not yet officially Rebbe, the Rebbe spoke to him different than as a Rebbe, as a Nasi. But it's hard to say that, especially since he was a Bocher. I told you this once before. My Zaydi Schusterman, Zaydi Schusterman told me that Harav Yerachmiel ben Yomensen, he was called the Zloben Erov, that was his name. He lived in Montreal. He came to the Rebbe for Chayel, Tafshin Yud Chayel. And he went into the Rebbe Yechidus. And he told the Rebbe, Mele uns Alte wollen sich ein Eize geben. Aber was wird sein mit den Jungen? He said, us old people will figure it out. What's going to be with the youth? And the Rebbe said to him, von der Jungen habe ich sich keinmal nicht abgesagt. In other words, the young guy was their Rebbe from the first day. The young guy habe ich sich keinmal nicht abgesagt. So it's hard to say that this Siche, which is printed in the Sefer, Yemei Bereishis, you could see it. I think he wrote it, and I think the Rebbe even fixed it. That was Magia. It's printed there. The Ksav and the Tiktuk, it's typed out. Most people, Shinuyim, have to do with Yetzer Hara. You're in a better mood, you're in a worse mood, there's David Sich Besser. Anyway, putting that aside, the idea of Dovor HaMosor L'Leiv, if you're dealing with things that do with the heart, Rebbe doesn't use these words. Lo kol ha'ishim shavim, lo kol ha'anoshim shavim, v'lo kol ha'itim shavim. People are not the same at times. So Alter Rebbe started Perek Yudalid by speaking about Midas HaBeinani and Midas Kol Adam. That the Midah of Beinani is for everybody the same, because Einei Davar HaMosor L'Leiv has nothing to do with emotion. And when it comes to action, Kol ha'ishim shavim, v'kol ha'itim shavim. When it comes to action, all people are equal, and all time. There's no moods in behavior, in Maise. In Regesh, there's moods in how I feel. There's differences. I'm olazeh, sometimes like this, sometimes like this. But when it comes to action, we're all equal in our ability. We're learning Tanya. When it comes to action, we're all equal. So after the Alter Rebbe spent what is for us 3 classes or 4 classes explaining this idea, he says the other side, we read this 2 weeks ago. We read this. I'm reading it again. As opposed to Dovar HaMosor L'Leiv, when it comes to Regesh, comes to the emotions of the heart, the Hainu this means, and I told you then that I was going to relearn it. I even wrote myself a note that we're going to relearn it. The Hainu. That the evil should be disgusted in one's heart, v'sanei, and hated. And then the Alter Rebbe says, b'tachlas hasina, with complete hatred, or yafilu shalei b'tachlas hasina, or even with not complete hatred. Okay, so let's pause right here. When you're talking about Dover and Moshe L'Leiv, this is much more tricky. That's the implication in context. Since we started off about Midas HaBeinani and it's not Dover HaMosor L'Leiv at all. In other words, Madregas HaBeinani is Melucha Memshala, is also totally Dover HaMosor L'Leiv. Midas HaBeinani is no hearts. Belay level, how you feel is immaterial. Behaviorally, actionably, in a level of action, a person breaks his life down into increments of minutes or seconds. I can always be about B'chol. What's the Lashon inside? B'chol Eis or B'chol Shah. Yecheles Reshus Nesuna L'Chaladim Laseis Adaber L'Achshiv. When it comes to behavior, comes to action, there's no differences in people, and there's no differences in time. On the other side, you're talking about Dover L'Mosor L'Leiv, it becomes very complicated. Now, one of the areas of complication is the following. It's really a chazorah, it's a repetition from what we learned in Perek Yud, in chapter 10. And there we discussed it at length. Here, I'm Pasha translating it. 2 weeks ago when we learned this, I ran over this, and I plan to go back to it. I'm not going to give you a long arichas, I'm just going to give you a very short inyan, a very short nakuda. And that nakuda is that the definition of a tzaddik is Oyave Hashem Sinura. The meaning of a tzaddik is that he loves Hashem and he hates evil. You'll see later in Tanya, in the next Perek, we're learning Yudalit. We're learning Tanya. In Perek Tezvav, in chapter 15, the Alter Rebbe is going to introduce us to a Beinani, who has a Yetzer Hara, who's called Lo Yavode. He's not working hard. How could it be a person with a Yetzer Hara, he's a Beinani, and he's not working hard? Alter Rebbe is going to tell you if you have certain personality traits, Mitzunin betivei, Mechuser Hegeshana betivei, If you have certain character traits, it's possible that you could be totally from precise and exact in your time and your kiyum mitzvahs and cold as a fish. And it's called loy avada. You're a beinoni with yetzer hara. It never bothers you. Why? You have no motivation for an aveda. So in other words, a tzaddik is not defined by no avedis alone. A tzaddik isn't even defined by no avedis and no struggle. A tzaddik is defined by Oyave Hashem Sinura, two things. He loves Hashem and he hates evil. It's a pasuk. Oyave Hashem Sinura. We say it Friday night in davening, and we say it Leil Yom Kippurim. We sing that same mizmid David Havu, right? Before Kol Nidre, we sing Oyave Hashem Sinura. Shemin Nafshes Chatzilim Yad Hashem Atzilim Eir Zaru Al Tzadik Lishnei Leiv Simcha. You probably know it's Sefer Tevis Reb Akiva. Eir Zaru Al Eir is Reish. Zaru is Ayin. La Tzadik is Kuf. Well, Yishrei is Yud. Leiv Simcha is Rabbi Akiva. You'll remember it. Now that I'm telling you this, you'll remember this was the capital Tilim that we say before called Nidre. On Yom Kippur, night Yom Kippur. We say every Friday night in the L'chon Ranana, in the Psukim that we say before L'chodedi. So it says, Oyev Hashem Sinura. A Tzadik loves Hashem and he hates evil. And the Lashon in Chassidus is it's Beis Kavim Shkulim. They're equal and opposite. The degree of love for the Eibishter determines the degree of hate for evil. And the degree of hate for evil determines love for the Eibishter. To use an analogy from algebra, if you know one and you don't know the other, you can figure out the unknown from the known. If a person knows Avas Hashem, how much he loves the Eibishter, he can know how much he hates Ra, even if he hasn't figured that out. And if you know how much you hate evil, and I think that's a lot easier to know, how much you hate evil is easier to know, that determines your Avalad Hashem. So the Rebbe says, if you love the Eibishter, Shalei B'tachlis Ha'ahava, if you love Hashem, it's not maximum love, it's because you're saying Ra, Shalei B'tachlis Ha'sina. Your hatred for evil is not absolute, and vice versa. If your Avas Hashem is betachlis, if you love the Eibishter absolutely, so your sinner for Ra, your hatred for evil is also betachlis. And in Perek Yud, which was for us a long time ago, the Alter Rebbe said this is what separates a tzaddik gomer, a tzaddik v'tev lei, from a tzaddik she'enei gomer that's called a tzaddik v'ra lei. If a person has evil inside of himself, on the madreg of tzaddik, he cannot hate evil completely because he can't hate himself. So his love for Hashem is incomplete. But if a person is a tzaddik gomer, that v'tzaddik v'toiv loy, he transformed his evil into good, and this poshet no yetzer hara mamish. So then his ava for the Eibush is also, what does it say inside of the Lashon? B'tachlis sinner. The tzaddik gomer is b'tachlis sinner, and the tzaddik she'eni gomer is shalei b'tachlis sinner. That's the touch of the words, very, very simply speaking. But the criteria of a tzaddik is that he loves Hashem and he hates evil, and the two are proportional, or proportionate. The degree to one loves Hashem, he hates evil. The degree to one hates evil, one loves Hashem. A tzaddik she'enei gomer has ra in him. Tzaddik v'ra loy. The Alter Rebbe teaches evil inside him, so his hatred for evil is not complete. So his love for the Eibush is not complete. And of course, the irony is, the thing that's strange about it is that a tzaddik gomer's sinner for ra is a kalta sinner. The perfect tzaddik's hatred for evil is a cold hate. The tzaddik she'enei gomer's hatred to evil is a passionate hate. Why? Because the tzaddik she'enei gomer has a connection to the evil. So his hatred is, if you will, personal. The tzaddik gomer, the tzaddik v'teva has no shaykhis to that. He hates it more. He hates it b'tachlas hasina. But it's not tefis makim. It's a cold hate. In other words, the fact that the tzaddik she'enei gomer has a little bit of ra in him is like the little speck of dust in the oyster. You know, it creates an irritation. And it shows itself in a srachus, in a fire. The tzaddik gomer, because there's no ra in him, you know, like the Rebbe said, the Lashon benegay to tu b'yavel, shash tilum, anarash. And that's the meaning of this line, right? That when you're talking with Avodah Masal Aleiv, talking about emotions, it's not so simple. We were talking earlier in this Perek, Adavar she'enei Masal Aleiv, something which has nothing to do with the heart. And when you talk about things that are einam mesurim l'leiv, kol ha'ishim, kol ha'itim shavim, all people, all men, and all women, and all times are equal. When it comes to action, there's no changes, no moods. Davar ha'masal l'leiv, you talk about emotion, there's a gewalt. Now we're talking about a beinoni. And the Beinani's Madregas HaBeinani, the Maidani of Perek Yud Beis, Hamalucha v'Memshala is davar amasal alev. But here the Alter Rebbe decides to generalize. You want to talk about emotions? Yeah. So there's a Beinani's emotions, there's a Tzaddik She'eini Gomer's emotions, there's a Tzaddik Gomer's emotions. It's a complicated field. It's complicated. It's not simple. It's not simple in people, and it's not simple in times. And we're going to continue to read inside, okay? And you're going to have to forgive me. I'm starting again 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Yud Testament Beis, page 38, at the end of the line. On the other hand, when you're dealing with something which has to do with emotions, Hainu, this means that one should have a disgust for evil, mamish, in his heart, visane, and hate it. And here you have the 2 levels: betachlis sin with the maximum of hate, which is the madrega of tzaddik gomer, or feel shalei betachlis sin and not the maximum hate, which is the madrega of tzaddik she'eini gomer. Says the Alter Rebbe, here it's complicated. Beinani on the level of Midah is not complicated, because we're not talking about anything but action. You're talking about anything else, here it's complicated. And the Rebbe says the minute you start talking about complicated, for lack of words, nobody's ever finished. When you're talking about the realm of Davar HaMasal Alev, there's no end in sight. And here's how he argues it. Says the Rebbe, when you want to talk about truth, and you want to talk about Davar HaMasal Alev, truth on the level of emotion, says the Rebbe, you never have it. Now, I want to remind you, where did we have the words Emes Lamite before? In the previous Perek. Remember? How did Perek Yud Gimel finish? Perek Yud Gimel finished with our favorite question. Why am I not a hypocrite? Am I not a hypocrite? Right? I'm a hypocrite. So what did the Alter Rebbe say? What did the Alter Rebbe say? Hareini Kere. Right? Sfas Emes Tikin La'ad. Remember? Va'ad Argil, a change. The Alter Rebbe has to push the kash. There's a rule about the word Emes. There's a rule about the word truth. It doesn't fluctuate. There's no moods. It's always the same. And Alter Rebbe said, I don't understand. The Beinani is by definition moody. Sometimes, like Lashon from Reb Kushya Lepler, Chosed Prishal, Chosed came, the Chosed left. I'm excited, I'm on, I'm off, I'm passionate, I'm cold. So the Alter Rebbe said, how is that emes? So the Alter Rebbe answered how for the Beinani it's emes. Now we go to the next Perek, and we start talking about a lower Beinani. And what are we saying about this lower Beinani? That this lower Beinani has nothing. We're not talking about feelings at all. We're simply talking about controlling yourself 1 minute at a time. Reduce your life, it's so easy to say, into increments of 60 seconds, and every minute be a Beinani, b'maise, b'dibur, or b'machshava for 1 minute. After he finishes this, he goes back to Davar HaMasal Alev. But he's not as kind as he was in the last Perek. In Perek Yud Gimel, he talks about the Beinani, and he says, isn't the Beinani a hypocrite? Sometimes he's on, and sometimes he's off. And the Alter Rebbe said, Sfas Emes Tikin La'ad. Abreke Le'emes is Eichet La'ad. A little bit of truth is also in eternity. Now, he goes back, he says, you want to talk about Emes? You want to talk about Emes? The biggest tzaddikim in that Emes Lamid. In other words, in the previous Perek, he was, for lack of words, he was being kind to the Beinani and saying that his moods is emes. Then he went to a lower Beinani, that's beklal, not moods. And when he finishes with this lower Beinani, he says, you want to talk about moods, ali b'de emes? You want to be really honest? Even a tzaddik gomer is not emes lamid. Why? Look at the words. Hine, zeh, that a person should say, that Davar HaMasal Alev, that his emotional relationship with the Eibishter is be'emes la'amite, is absolutely true. Says the Rebbe, I'afsher, sheyeh be'emes la'amite, it can never be true. Not only it's not true in a Beinani, like he said in the previous Perek, the Beinani who has Davar HaMasal Alev, Hamlucha v'Memshala, Midregas HaBein. It's not even true in Tzaddik. Why not? It's Ella al Yedei Gedel V'Teikef Ha'ahav al Havayeh. For a person's davar amosal alev, for a person's emotional connection to the Eibishter, to be in the madreg of emes lamite cannot be unless he's holding by the bechina of ava b'tanugim, where his love for HaKadosh Baruch was on a level of delight. And again, how do you translate the word ahava? I want. How do you translate the word tainug? I have. Ava b'tanugim is a dichotomy. Ava, it says in Chassidus, says in the word ava, ich will. Like it says in the Pasha from a couple of weeks ago, ava means I want. There's limited love, there's infinite love. I want a little, I want a lot, I want in a finite way, I want an infinite way. Ava b'tanugim means I have. In other words, Ayid, the Gemara says about 3 people, and only 3 people, that they were zeiche to what's called elam chatire b'chayecha. They experienced elam haba in elam hazeh. They had taineg alaki, noyam Hashem. Right, there are different expressions that we had also in Tanya. Correct? Says the Rebbe ve'ein kol adam zeiche lazeh. If you want to talk about love of masal aleiv, you want to flip it the other way. You don't like this idea that midas habenyani and midas kol adam ve'ein nedavar amos. It's nothing to do with emotions. When you're talking about emotions, nobody's good enough. Not even the tzaddik. Because for a person to be emotionally davar masal aleiv, in a madreg of emes lamite, that there's no changes, there's no moods in his life, he has to be holding by the madreg of Abed Tanugim. And the Rebbe says, Ve'ein kol adam zeiche lezeh. Not everybody merits it. What's the meaning of the word zeiche? What's the title of the word zeiche? That it's not up to me. Avoid is not a schus, avoid is a schar. Zeiche means the Eibush that gives you a schus. The Rambam writes about Nevuah. The Rambam writes about Nevuah. That there was a group of people who were called B'nai HaNevi'im. B'nai HaNevi'im doesn't mean the biological children of Nevi'im. It means the Ruchnistic children of Nevi'im. B'nai HaNevi'im. And what does the Rambam write about B'nai HaNevi'im? He says these are people who are schooled in the art of Nevuah. The Rambam writes, just like we now have yeshivas. You have bigger yeshivas and smaller yeshivas and better yeshivas and not such good yeshivas. In the time of Bayis Rishon, they had yeshivas for Nevuah. Now, to get into such a yeshiva, you had to be on the highest madrega of limud atayra you could imagine. In other words, chokhmah was considered davar cotton. You understand? Nigla was no big deal. People who were badre. So the Rambam says the people called Bnei Nevi'im. That means that they had enough background. They were in enough of a madrege where they were accepted into a group where they were being conditioned for Nevuah, with all the rules of conditioning, that they would meditate and they would be joyous, the different things that are required. And then the Rambam writes, and I'm not saying it verbatim because I don't remember it word for word, Lepa'amim yishre u lepa'amim lo yish. Sometimes the Nevuah came, sometimes the Nevuah didn't come. And then the Rambam writes, once a person experienced Nevuah once in his life, he was never the same person ever. In other words, even a person had Nevuah one time and he was never zeiche, that Kvayachal, the Shechina, should rest upon him a second time, it was life-changing. But if the Eibusha didn't want, it didn't rest. And it wasn't the pshat it didn't rest because you did less work. It wasn't the pshat it didn't rest because you were somehow inferior to the other guy. The Eibusha decided, no, that's it. That's the meaning of the word schus. Schus means it's not up to me. I can work and I can work and I can work. There are certain things I cannot get. The Eibusha gives me. The Rebbe says, understand that when you want to talk about davar amasal alev, when you want to talk about the idea that there's a relationship with the Eibush which is not just behavior, maise, but emotions and seichel, intellect and neshama, davar amasal alev. So you should know the emes la'amite of davar amasal alev is available to no one because it's a schus. Hashem decides if He wants, you have it. And if He decides, you don't have it. You can work and work. A person gets till a certain point. But the idea that there should be an emes la'amite, no changes, a constant state of dveikus and the Eibishter, b'li shinuyim, which makes the davar amasal alev, the emotional connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, be'emes la'amite, this is a schos. I'll tell you, I'm moiden de kamaise. I'm moiden de kamaise. You could say that the maise is, I feel ashrek lecha maise. But this is the story. The story was like this. Rabbi Hillel Paratcha was an Adam Gadol. I mean, you don't need me to tell you. Rabbi Hillel Patch was an Adam Gadol. He was a very great chassid. What I think we don't even have the words for, I really believe this, we don't have oisis for this. Rabbi Hillel Patch was a very big mekusher. His chassidus was Rebbe. Now that sounds so obvious. It sounds so obvious. First of all, in our generation, that's the only chassidus we have. There's nothing else but the Rebbe. They were Avdim. And Vashenis, it's really true that for a bigger person, a person who has his own milis, Rebbe is more complicated. Rabbi Hillel was a moedendike mekusher. In other words, there were many great chassidim, and every chassid had a Rebbe, and every chassid's chassidus, every chassid's avodas Hashem growth had to do with the koiches and the brachas and the hiron hadracha he got from his Rebbe. But Rabbi Hillel was unique in this prat of his kashas. I mean, to the extent, as we know the word that Tzemach Tzedek said about Rabbi Hillel, that he's a half a chassid. So, half a chassid. So they said to the Tzemach Tzedek, what about the other half? He said, the other half is Rebbe. They asked the Tzemach Tzedek, what do you mean the other half is Rebbe? So the Rebbe, our Rebbe, said, what do you mean the other half is Rebbe? That he was a Rebbe unto his own. There's only one Rebbe. The other half of Rabbi Hillel Parasher was the Tzemach Tzedek. It's a pneumistic thing on a level which, I mean, a Rebbe can understand it. What does it mean to me and you? A person who's so great in Torah and Avodah, Rabbi Hillel Parasher, and yet everything he is a Rebbe is very deep. It's deep. It's very, very deep. And here's the story, okay? The story is a simple one. Rabbi Hillel was on Lubavitch. And parenthetically, Rabbi Hillel Parasha did not like sick people. Sick people. Why is it the sick person's fault that he's sick? The bottom line is the goof is covering over the neshama. This was his word. The Tzemach Tzedek was ill. Tzemach Tzedek war nicht gesund. Tzemach Tzedek was sick. He couldn't walk. He could barely move. And he lived like this for many years, for 5 years. As it would turn out, that Tzemach Tzedek lived longer than Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Hillel was never really ill. He passed away from fasting Tisha B'Av, you understand? Somebody told me that he used to fast 48 hours Tisha B'Av. That's to give in there. 2 days. Not, 1 day was not enough for him. He had Tzveik the Yom and Tisha B'Av. Anyway, Rabbi Hillel was on Lubavitch. Rabbi Hillel was in his late 60s. Rabbi Hillel was from the greatest chassidim. And he was listening to Younger Light. Younger Light. I mean, what Younger Light mean? Teenagers, young adults. But then, the Tzemach Tzedek's Younger Light, they're not. They were very, very substantive people. They were not superficial and you know, the Rebbe does all the work and I sit and look at him and I'm Yotzei Chasidus. They were serious people. But they were young. And they were discussing the Rebbe's health. And one says to the other, you know, it used to be so good when the Rebbe was healthy. There was Maimorim, and there was Yechidus, and there was Fabrengenischen, and there was... It's that everything is so depressed. The Rebbe is gesund, you can't go into him, you can't see him. And I don't know what they were saying. Chassidus is less often, Chassidus is shorter, Yechidus is shorter. Whatever the case was, the bottom line was they were lamenting... What's the bad word in Lubavitch? The matziv, yeah, that's the code word, the matziv. Everything pessimistic is in 3 letters, matziv, yeah. And in atzvos you also have a tzaddik and a beis, just like in matziv, you have a tzaddik and a beis. Anyway, Rabbi Hillel couldn't take it. Because they were saying that Rebbe is sick. So Rabbi Hillel got up, and he walked into the Tzemach Tzedek's room and took a look at him. Rabbi Hillel was allowed to do that. He didn't walk into... Rabbi Hillel walked into the cheder of the Rebbe, he looked at the Rebbe and he walked out. And he walked over to this younger light and he said, the Rebbe is gesund. Okay, no, noch a Meshuggah. Everybody knew the Hillel Baraj was a Meshuggah. He's an Adam Gadol. But when it came to Rebbe, he was not like everybody else. He didn't see Rebbe, how do they say it? Normal. So I said to him, what are you talking about? The Tzemach Tzedek couldn't walk. He couldn't take care of himself. Tzemach Tzedek was sitting at his table, burning pidyenes, and his beard caught fire. He was a very limited person, begashmias. So Rabbi Hillel said, Bazeh HaLoshon. Azeh steht in der Sipurim. Nicht von Rebben, das ist von Chassidim. Liegt in Ave Betanugim. Losem optreten von Ave Betanugim wird kennen gehen. In English, yeah? He's immersed in this level, Ave Betanugim. And again, how do I translate the words? The want of actually having. He's dveikus nelikus, but the highest dveikus nelikus. higher than Atzilus. The Tzemach Tzedek cannot physically move because him and God are one. If he'll step away from it, I tell you he can walk. Okay, so how do you think they looked at the Hillel? I can tell you anything I want. I can tell you anything I want. Dingzach. But there's a hemshech to the mice. It's not I put the stories together, but there's a story, another story. Tzemach Tzedek couldn't walk. And Tzemach Tzedek didn't sleep. He was still a gelernt Tag Nacht. Tzemach Tzedek was a masmid elaki. Tzemach Tzedek's diligence in Torah was unbelievable. And he was always in need of Sforim. Forgive me for digressing. Reb Sheil Baruch wrote the Rebbe a letter, which they printed 4 years ago when we had the 150th yard site of the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek. Tov Shin Ayin Vav. It was 4 years ago. We had the 150th yard site of the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek. So they printed this letter. Reb Sheil knew a Yid in Lubavitch who was the last Yechidus by the Tzemach Tzedek before the Tzemach Tzedek passed away. The last Yechid, Tzemach Tzedek passed away Yud Gimel Nissen. I think this was Tuesday, Yud Aleph Nissen. Mamish a day or two before. He went into the Tzemach Tzedek and he asked Inyani Avoida. Tzemach Tzedek could speak Inyani Avoida. And the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, when he gave to Inyan HaTshuva, you should look in Igeres HaTshuva. Now you're talking 150 years ago. It's hard for you to understand this, but the Tanya was originally printed in Slavite, just 2 sections. Sefer Shal Beinanim and then Shari Yichmuna. The Igeres HaTshuva was added in a later print. The Igeres HaKedesh, Yekutas Achim, was B'chal after the Alter Rebbe passed away. So the Tzemach Tzedek had that. This was the language then. You wish you could have such a sefer today. It's worth hundreds of dollars. It's a keepsake. It's a collector's item. But then it was a Tanya on Igeres HaTshuva. That's the Loshen. A Tanya without the Igeres HaTshuva. Tzemach Tzedek had the Tanya on his desk, and he wanted to show this Yid something written in the Igeres HaTshuva. So he opened up the Tanya. He saw that it was missing. He didn't have it. So he rang his bell or whatever it is. He called his Misharis. The Misharis was Chaim Ber. Chaim Ber was out of his mind. I know people today in Lubavitch over his Einiklach. You read these stories, you don't know who to stone. Bring me a Tanya with Igeres HaTshuva. So Rabbi Chaim Ber says to the Tzemach Tzedek, it can treff nice and wenig. Like, what do you want? You know it by heart. I have to bring you the book for heaven's sakes. Just say it. He told the Tzemach Tzedek, I'm not bringing you the book. A chutzpah, yeah? Chutzpah. But this happened 1,000 times a day. On a guzman. He was bringing a safe every 2 seconds. So he says, Rebbe, I have to bring you Igeres HaTshuva. Just tell them what's written there. You know it by heart anyway. I have to go and bring you a book. The guy was a whole day collecting books, a whole night. So the Tzemach Tzedek said it by heart. Azay steht in Sipur. He told the Tzemach Tzedek, if it treffen the voice and wenig, like, why should I bother? You know it anyway. So this is the story with this Reb Chaim Ber. When Tzemach Tzedek got sick, the Tzemach Tzedek said, sleep outside my door on a cot. And if I'll need you, I'll call you. No, so he took Negelwasser, gelegt schlafen. 5 minutes, Chaim Ber. So he got up, he washed Negelwasser. Yeah, Rebbe, I need a book from here. I think he climbed up on the ladder. Tzemach Tzedek safe. Cheder was full of svarim. He brought it down and went back to sleep. 5 minutes later, Chaim Ber, a whole night, and he can't schlafen. And everybody knew that Tzemach Tzedek knew his whole library by heart, verbatim. There's a story with the Rebbe Marash, and look at the Deburim about that. Anyway, he decided schlaft. So Tzemach Tzedek is calling him. He's sleeping. Eyes wide awake. He couldn't anymore. So Tzemach Tzedek is begging him, I need a sefer. Chaim Ber reads sich nicht. So he became quiet. It's a true story. Upon him, I miss a mice. I can't say it's true. If the Frierdiker Rebbe tells the story, I can tell you the story is true. The Chassidim tell a story. The Rebbe writes in the Akdam of Sefer HaSichas, Teireh Shalom, that Chassidim were Mesudim l'Rabbeim, and they were very careful to be medayek in every word. And even though it's a fact of life that shkiyas mi yovin, that people could make mistakes, but b'derech klal Hasidim, because of their earnestness, delivered it accurate. This is not even a dvar, it's just a story. Tzemach Tzedek sang the Alter Rebbe's niggin of the Dal Bavas. And he got out of his seat, the man was paralyzed. Got out of his seat, he walked over to the ladder, he moved it, he climbed up the ladder, he took the sefer, he climbed down the ladder, he sat back down. So the way the story is written in that sefer, Reb Chaim Ber never slept again. He was a witness to Gilui Lakus. He's in his battle given. Ayich de Tzelach HaMaise mamish from 2 days before the Estalkus, where he told the Tzemach Tzedek, treffen the Weiss of Wenig, hosta kashe. But this is the story. So Rabbi Hillel Paritch has said, the Rebbe can't walk. Liegt in Ava B'Tanugim. Ava B'Tanugim, the Rebbe calls it a schus. So you're going to say that until the Tzemach Tzedek took ill, he was not in the Madreg of Ava B'Tanugim. You know the story with the Alter Rebbe. It's a famous story, right? The Alter Rebbe was by the Mezritcher Magid. I'm talking too much. I'll tell you about the Mezritcher Magid. And it was within 3 days of the Estalkus of the Mezritcher Magid. And the Mezritcher Magid said to the Alter Rebbe, Zalmenu vozestu. Zalmenu, what do you see? So the Alter Rebbe looked up at the ceiling, and the ceiling was unfinished, so you could see the beams. So the Alter Rebbe said, "Ich sehe a Balken. I see a beam." So the Maggid told him, "Ich sehe schon nicht kein Balken. Ich sehe the Dvar Havaya was Mahava Machayu Makayim Dvar. I don't see a beam anymore. I see the godliness which is sustaining it, and it's brought in Sfarim, and I don't know where these Sfarim are, that a tzaddik on this madrege, 3 days before the Estalkus, doesn't see the physical world." And then, of course, the same story repeated it with the Alter Rebbe himself. That 3 days, Alter Rebbe passed away Motzei Shabbos. 3 days before the Estalkus, the Alter Rebbe said to his grandson, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, Mendel, "Vos zestu?" And the Tzemach Tzedek said, "Zeh zeh balken." I see a beam, and the Alter Rebbe said the same thing. I don't see a beam, I see the Dvar Havaya. So I don't have pshatim, but this is emes. That the Alter Rebbe says, "Loi kol adam zeichel azeh," means Ava B'Tanugim you don't reach. Ava B'Tanugim you get as a schus. B'meile, what's the Alter Rebbe's point? The Alter Rebbe's point is, if you want to talk about Davar Amos Alev, about the spiritual, emotional, intellectual, spiritual connection with the person of the Eibishter, and the words emes lamite, the biggest tzaddikim may not have it. And a Poshet Yid, who's not at all involved in Amos Alev, he's just Nizer and Machshava, Diber, Umayset. That's emes. Why? Because there's no shinuyim, there's no moods, there's no changes. That's the spirit of the piece of Tanya. What practical hayra there is in this, I don't know. But that's how you read the Hemshech, that's how the Pedic reads. And I'm going to continue to read. I'm on third line from the top of page Chaf Amud Aleph. Ve'ein kol adam zeichel hazeh. Not everybody merits this madrege, which is called Ava B'Tanugim. Kizeu ke'ein kibul schar. It's almost like a reward. Now, ahava is an avoida. Loving Hashem is a mitzvah, I say deraisa. V'ahavta Hashem elokach. It's a mitzvah to love Hashem, which means Hashem commanded us. He gave us the koyach, and a person has a possibility on some level and in some way and to some degree to love Hashem. How could you call it a schus? So the Alter Rebbe says because it's ke'ein kibul schar. Yeah, ava is avoida. This ahava is someplace in between the avoid of Avos Hashem and the schar. In other words, it's really something that the biggest tzaddikim have as a schus. And he brings the loshen from the pasuk, who could exhibit this as in the pasuk, Aveidas matana eten es kunaschem v'gemer. That Hashem says to the kohen in Pashat Kerach, I'm giving you the union of the kahuna, and he calls it the work of a gift. And I think this I did talk about 2 weeks ago, that the word work and the word gift are a contradiction. Why? A work means I earn it. Gift means I didn't earn it. So which is it? Did I earn it or did I not earn it? So this is brought, you know, in V'hayak Yisavei Alor, Friday I gave a Maimon class. V'hayak Yisavei Alor, that Hashem L'kecha Neisin L'cha, the Rebbe says, V'hayak Yisavei means you came there on your own. Neisin means it's a matana. And the Rebbe asked the same question. Did you earn it or is it a gift? So it says in Chassidus that a gift is earned indirectly. The simplest mashal for a gift is a bonus. Say you work in a company, in a business, or whatever, it doesn't matter what. And it comes the end of the year, and the balabatim, the overseers, the menahalim, hand out bonuses. They don't give everybody a bonus. They don't give everybody the same bonus. A person who, as they say, went the extra mile gets a bonus. If he went the extra 2 miles, he gets a bigger bonus. Could you take your employers to court and demand a bonus? No. Is the bonus for free? Oichet nicht. What is it? So there's an expression, the Gemara, Ilav de Yoav le Naicha le Nafsha le Ilav de Ovid le Naicha le Nafsha le Yoav le Matante. If it weren't that the employee did a Nachas Ruach for his boss, for his employer, he wouldn't give him the bonus. So was it earned or not? The answer is both. It's earned because he didn't get it for nothing. It's not earned because he's not entitled to it. It's more than he's entitled to. That's meaning avoida, you work, and sometimes you have a schus and you get a matana. A matana is not for free, even though it's not deserved. It's deserved indirectly. Says the Rebbe, that's such ke'en kibbutz. The level of ava b'tanugim, loving the Eibishter, on the level which is called not wanting, but actually having, is so elusive, and we're talking about the biggest tzaddik, that it's ke'en kibbutz char. So, Chris, what's the Alter Rebbe's point? And you wonder why the Alter Rebbe puts this into the Tanya. But he says, you want to talk about emes? You want to talk about truth? The biggest tzaddikim halten nicht by emes. Emes lamite, absolute truth. You know, in the previous Pedic, we were complaining that the Beni is not holy by emes, and the Alter Rebbe explained how it is emes. In this Pedic, you want to talk about Dovar HaMosel Alev? Take? Yeah, you want to talk about the realms, the prospects, the possibilities for tzaddikim? So you should know there's no emes lamite. You know, there's stories in our culture that are very, very sharp and very, very uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you one that you never heard, because it's a tape, Pashut, from the Rebbe. And I don't know if anybody has formulated it into a story. And Efshe Bashafachis. But you could listen to the tape and you could hear the whole tone. Everybody knows, everyone in Lubavitch knows that there's a famous Purim, yeah? What's Purim? Famous Purim Tovshin Chai. Everyone, Purim 1958, famous Purim Tovshin Chai. But there's a Purim which is just as amazing, just as Giluyim. I don't know why it's not celebrated in the same way, but when you listen to the tape, I say in certain aspects, it's a bigger Gili, even than Purim Tovshin Chai. Purim Tov Shin Tez Zayin. 2 years before, we took a Sach Mashke. And so, I'm not going to tell you now all the Prati Advonim, but apparently somebody fell asleep. The Fabrengens went on all night. Now, I don't know who this somebody was, but it wasn't me. First of all, I wasn't born. And second, if I was born, with such Juliks like me, the Rebbe is not wasting his time. And the Rebbe said, he brought up from Sforim, that falling asleep comes from Klippe. From Klippe. Now, I don't know who was there, I don't know who it was, you know what, I will nicht wissen. But upon him it was another choshev. The Rebbe didn't say it to a child. I mean, in those years behind the Rebbe, so given upon him, Lubavitch had upon him, then, much more than later. Maybe he's nicht zugepasst to der Ashvi, aber sein gewinn Gdoilim. I mean, Shmuel was not a simple person. Rabbi Simpson was not a simple person. Wird die geheißen, Schneers und Tversky, the rest of them gedenk ich nicht. He sat by those Fabrengens. These were Gdoilim, Anoshim, there were people behind the Rebbe that deserved to be sitting behind the Rebbe. Like Reb Mendel said, nicht azay sollst du nicht sein, or azay sollst du sein. Apparently one of them fell asleep. And the Rebbe had makbet gewesen. The Rebbe probably was a lot younger than him. I don't know. Again, I don't know who it is. I'm just imagining. If the Rebbe should comment to a Yid who fell asleep by Fabrengen. And what happened, again, you only hear half the story. But apparently this person was hurt by the comment. So then the Rebbe apologizes, Pashat. He proceeds to apologize. How did he apologize? So he made a joke that Rabbi Chadokov had a son whose name was Sholem Yisrael. So people didn't call him Sholem Yisrael, they called him Sholem Al Yisrael. The Rebbe was apologizing. You can hear the tape. The Rebbe took a gaval mit mashke. But I mean, the Rebbe acted like such a regular person. And that's what made it so scary. Because he was sitting in the presence of a Rebbe, a Lakus. And in Tzadecha, there's a Menesh Abbas Abedam, and you have to be careful. You're mamish in Kedesh HaKadoshim. In those years, they would pay this. So you can hear it on the tape. You can hear it on the tape, where the Rebbe makes a comment. To fall asleep that a person should fall asleep without choice, in other words. I mean, I fall asleep in the middle of talking, I fall asleep in the middle of talking. A person should fall asleep because the goof overtook the neshama. Apparently, whoever the Rebbe said it to or about was on the madrege that the Rebbe should make the comment. Meaning to say, Tadecha, he fell asleep. Mitzad Sheni, the Rebbe held as a gedaft halten shene. The Rebbe knew who he was saying it to, but he said it in public. And the Rebbe makes this comment, and almost immediately you hear the Rebbe. The Rebbe doesn't say, I'm sorry. You understand? But the Rebbe says, he backs away from it. Anyway, what's my point? What's my point? You know, they're chassidim, yeah? Little nobodies. When they stand next to the Rebbe, they know they're nobody, yeah? But there's some people who are not nobodies. They're somebodies. And there's madregis in somebody. So the Alter Rebbe says all the somebodies have to know that when you're talking about emes la'amite, it's not that. It's not that. Because emes la'amite is ke'en kibus char. The madrege of Dovor Amosel Alev, that a Yid's Avodas Hashem on the level of spirituality, of Dveikus Nelakus, should be called Emes Lamite, it's almost not even an Avodah. In other words, it's not something you can even do. You're not going to say you're not doing it, but you're not going to say you did it by yourself. There's a schus that brings a person to this place. Now, I'm asking you again, what is this doing in Beinanim? This belongs in Sefer Shal Tzadikim, L'chayra. But the Alter Rebbe decides to put it here. That when he talked about a Beinani who has no feeling at all, any muscle lev, it's almost like saying to him, don't feel bad. You know why? Because when it comes to tzaddikim, they're never finished. Whatever they do, emes lamite, it's not. And the Alter Rebbe continues. V'lachein Omar Iev, this explains what Iev said, b'rasa tzaddikim v'chol. Now, what's the pashut attached of these words? V'lachein Omar Iev b'rasa tzaddikim. On the first page of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe asked a question. The Alter Rebbe asked a kasha that it says in the Gemara of Bava Basra, Iev said, b'rasa tzaddikim, b'rasa rishoyim. Hashem created some people to be tzaddikim, and Hashem created some people to be rishoyim. Frag the Alter Rebbe, v'at tzaddik v'rasha leika omar. Isn't it true that the Eibusha doesn't determine if a person is going to be a tzaddik or a rasha? Remember that? First page. So what's the teretz? A rasha doesn't mean rasha. Rasha means beinani. So what's the pshat b'rasa tzaddikim b'rasa rishoyim? Some people are created to be tzaddikim. In other words, they have a possibility to achieve what David HaMelech achieved. V'libi cholo b'kir b'kihorgi b'tainis. He has no yetzer hara. And other people know, like the Alter Rebbe beginning of Lamed Hey, they can lay galarik their whole life. They're going to be fighting with the yetzer hara. They'll never win. Right? So what's like b'rasa tzaddikim? Some people were created with the prospect, the possibility they can become tzaddikim, and some people are created with the prospect that they're going to be for their whole lives fighting with the yetzer hara in the madregas beinani. But if you look where it's written, you understand something else. The Alter Rebbe is not saying b'rasa tzaddikim in contrast to beinanim. B'rasa tzaddikim means that tzaddikim is a whole world, and in the world of tzaddikim, the question, the barometer of emes and sheker also exists. And the higher tzaddik is emes, and relative to him, the lower tzaddik is not emes. Or, the higher tzaddik, the lower tzaddik is emes, and the higher tzaddik is what the Rebbe calls here emes. In other words, b'rasa tzaddikim here doesn't necessarily even mean b'rasa tzaddikim as opposed to b'rasa rishoyim. B'rasa tzaddikim, the Eibishter made tzaddikim, and tzaddikim is a whole world. I'll tell you a second story. This isn't the Rebbe's Rishimis, where there should have been printed, it shouldn't have been printed, but it's a davar with the fusless of the datas. Megach the tzel and the Maisa. I get criticized sometimes for telling certain stories. We know that there was a falling out between the Mittel Rebbe and Reb Aaron Halevi Horowitz from Strashela, the Strashela. The Strashela in the Beis Rebbe is not even called a Chosa, it's called a Talmud. The Mechaber, the Beis Rebbe, calls the Reb Aaron Strashela a Talmud. You know, by the Baal Shem Tov there was Talmidim. By the Maggid there was Talmidim. By the Alter Rebbe there were Chassidim. But Reb Aaron HaGoya, Reb Aaron HaGodol, Reb Aaron HaLevi is called HaTalmud. He was older than the Mittel Rebbe by quite a few years. For a very, very long time, they were so close, they were inseparable. You know, the Chassidim used to call them Trei and Rei and the Lo Mispash. They were inseparable. They were this close. The Middle Rebbe and Aban. They were chavrusas. Somebody once told the Alter Rebbe, Trei and Rei, the Lo Mispash, and two friends that never part, and the Alter Rebbe sighed and he said, Halavai, the Lo Mispash. I wish that's true. In the last years of the Alter Rebbe's life, there was a falling out between the Middle Rebbe and Aban, Halevi. And when the Alter Rebbe was in Stalak, he opened up his own shop. He was very successful. But he was only one generation. He did not have a mamalim. His children were not mamalim okemi. And he lived longer than the Middle Rebbe. Strashela was a powerful chassidus with a lot of chassidim. And it's a long story which I don't even know all the pratim of, but maybe I don't want to know. But what was the falling out? What happened? This nobody knows. We just know there was a falling out. We don't know what it is. But in the Rebbe's Rishimis, it's revealed. The Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe privately, and they printed it. There's two stories there. One has to do with Alter Rebbe himself. Alter Rebbe was makpid on Abban Strashele that when he would write his chassidus, he wouldn't write it word for word. Lashon Harav. Alter Rebbe was very particular. The chassidim should write Lashon Harav, to write exactly his words, genoi, precise. And Abban Strashele wasn't careful. And the Alter Rebbe told him again and again he can't do it. And every time the Alter Rebbe would say it, what was the answer? Was ist mit Rebbe? The Middle Rebbe used to write Chassidus Alter Rebbe also. He also wasn't a Medaik in Lashon Harav. He also wrote long Pilpulim. Every word Alter Rebbe wrote, the Veistach, Tzemach Tzedek said, the Schwer hat gemacht von a Wort, a Quart. The Alter Rebbe said one word, and the Alter Rebbe, Middle Rebbe had a bucket full. So the Tzemach Frierdiker Rebbe writes about the Middle Rebbe's Chassidus, men can sail in ACS Harav vipedal, that he actually was, the Alter Rebbe's words are there, but they're so swallowed up. So Rabbi Strashel, I don't understand. You let your son, you don't let me? What's the teretz? The Rabbi Strashel wasn't the Middle Rebbe. It's simple. He was a Godel Shebegdoilim. Frierdiker Rebbe said about him, Harav Agon, Harav Tzadik, Harav Kodesh, aber nicht Rebbe. He was a great, great man. And the Alter Rebbe said, you have to write what I say verbatim, don't add and don't subtract. And he wouldn't listen. So Alter Rebbe canceled him. The worst punishment. 2 years for such a person. 2 years he can't visit Alter Rebbe. You know what that means for such a man? This was his lifeblood. So he went away for 2 years. Came back after 2 years, and the same thing happened the second time. And again the Alter Rebbe was makpid, and he would cancel him for 2 more years. And then he never came back. In other words, he had, not just with the Middle Rebbe, he had with Alter Rebbe, but it was over the fact that the Alter Rebbe treated the Middle Rebbe differently than he treated him. And it's not the pshat the Alter Rebbe had favoritism, it's that the Middle Rebbe was pushed in a different madrega. But there's another story, which is also brought in the Rishimis, which is it's a funny story. The story, it's hard to understand it. I think there was a fire in Liadi. And I don't understand the nature of this fire, but people ran to hide inside buildings to protect themselves from fire. How do you run to hide in a building to protect yourself from fire? Rabbi Strashel ran into a church. Maybe it was a stone structure. Maybe that was the word. When the Middle Rebbe heard, he laughed. That's the whole story. He laughed. What's the crime? What happened? Rabbi Strashel was trying to save his life. He ran into a base tiff. He ran into a church. It was a building. Again, I don't know this, but maybe it was a building of stone. And when the Middle Rebbe heard that, Allah keton. So I'll tell you a maaseh 100 years later. That Mendel Chaim was the Nezhen Erov. He was a chassid from the Rebbe Rashab. And there were pogroms. And all the clergy, that means Lahavdel, the Rabbonim, and the Galochim, went together to negotiate that they should stop the killing. And the pogromists wouldn't stop. They were killing they were killing Jews especially, but it was during the civil war in Russia. So the Galach said to the Mendel, come into the church. They will not enter the church. In other words, it was pekuach nefesh mamish. And the Mendel refused to enter the church, and they murdered him. They killed him al kiddush Hashem. The story happened almost exactly 100 years after this maaseh. Now, if you're trying to save your life and you run into a church, no one's going to hold it against you. But when you're talking about tzaddikim, in other words, that's the spirit of these 2 lines. Bros tzaddikim. Tzaddikim is a ganze Welt. Tzaddikim is a whole world. And let's finish, okay? I'm talking too long already. It says in Zayah. And what the Rebbe writes, there's a footnote here. There's a footnote here. I have the Rebbe's notes here. And the Rebbe finishes with the Tzadachin, but the Rebbe's Tzadachin is mamir a safe pasuk that it says in Zohar. Sheyash ben Neshamis Yisrael kama mini madregas u'bechinas. In Jewish souls, there's different steps, different categories. And what the Rebbe writes, again, the Rebbe writes it as a question, but I'm reading it as an answer, as a statement of fact, that this is not up to free will. These are pasha different souls. Just like tzaddik and beinoni is not up to free will. It's different souls. Tzaddik and tzaddik is also different souls. And it's not up to free will. And the Rebbe, like I said, the Rebbe says the tzaddikin, but we're going to read it without the tzaddikin. That there is certain criteria of neshamis which determine levels of tzaddikim, maybe even of tzaddikim gemurim. Chasidim, that's category number 1, and Chasidim means chesed, azei chaptes. Giboirim, and that means gevura. Hamizgabra ma'yitrim, who are strong over the Yetzer Hara. More Torah, Torah is Tiferes. Neviim v'chulu. In the Zohar it says Choizim, Neviim. Neviim means prophets and Choizim means prophets. The difference between the word Choiz and the word Navi, Choizim means a seer and Navi means a speaker. Every prophet has 2 parts, his vision and his communication. So a Choize or a Roya like Chazoin Evadia, Chazen Yeshayahu is the higher aspect of vision, someone who sees, and when he sees, he speaks the words of God. So the Alter Rebbe takes out Choizim and puts in a V'chulu, Nevi'im V'chulu, and by the way, the Rebbe says the V'chulu should be before Nevi'im, because in the Zohar that we have, it says Choizim and then Nevi'im, and then the Rebbe brings in the footnote that the Kisei Melech, which is a Pirush on Zohar, has a different version in the Zohar, that it says first Nevi'im and then Choizim. So the Rebbe says that the V'chulu means to say that two types of Navi. And the Rebbe says, Apikabol, it's Netzach and Hoid. So Chasidim is Chesed, Gebeirim is Gevura, Morei Teire is Tiferes, Nevi'im V'chulu is Netzach and Hoid, and Tzadikim is Yesoid V'chulu. So the Rebbe doesn't bring the V'chulu, the Rebbe doesn't say, the Rebbe brings from the Lashon HaZohar, Chasidim, Gebeirim, Morei Teire, Chezim, Nevi'im, Tzadikim. What the second V'chulu is, I don't know. Ayin Sham. But the Rebbe's interpretation of these few lines is that these are Poshet, Madregis, and Tzadikim, maybe even in Madregis of perfect Tzadikim. And the point is that if you want to talk about Emes, even by the biggest Tzadikim, it's not simple. It's not simple. Now, if you think about what we learned today, what was so wonderful about today's class is that it wasn't personal. It didn't bother anybody. Why? I'm not a Tzadik. But the Alter Rebbe put it into the Tanya. So the good news is that next week, I don't know what's going to be next Sunday, it's going to be Slichas. We're not reading this again. We're going to start from Ubazeh. Okay, let's take a break. And I want to talk about Teimchet Tmimim. 2 days ago, Chamisha Asa Be'elul was the Yom Haledet of Teimchet Tmimim. Instead of the Hayem Yem, we're going to